It was April 14th, 1972, and Ray Hollister was 41 years old when he stood in the gravel lot of the Crenshaw Estate auction and decided not to raise his hand. The auctioneer was moving fast through farm equipment that had belonged to a man who died without children, and the Massey Ferguson 1100 diesel tractor sat 20 feet away with its front loader still attached. Ray had driven 11 miles to see it. He had walked around it twice that morning. He knew what it could do. He also knew what it would cost, and when the bidding started at $1,800, Ray folded his arms and stayed quiet. His younger brother Carl was standing beside him. Carl was 36. He had 200 fewer acres than Ray, but he had been watching grain prices climb for 3 straight years, and he believed the moment was right. When the auctioneer called for more bids, Carl raised his hand. Ray did not stop him. He did not say anything at all. He watched his brother buy the Massey Ferguson 1100 for $4,200, and when it was over, Carl shook hands with the estate lawyer and Ray walked back to his truck alone. Ray farmed 320 acres in southern Kansas, land his father had bought in 1938 after working as a hired man for most of the Depression. The farm had no debt. The house had no mortgage. Ray owned 2 tractors outright, a Massey Ferguson 65 and an older 35 that still ran most days. He also owned a grain truck, a disc harrow, a 4-row planter, and a combine he had bought used in 1967. Everything was paid for. Everything worked. Ray believed that staying out of debt was the only reliable protection a farmer had, and he had built his operation around that belief since the day his father died in 1964 and left him the place. Carl farmed 180 acres, 4 miles west. He had started with less, but he had been renting an additional quarter section since 1969, and in 1971 he signed a lease-to-own agreement on another 60 acres that bordered his home place. Carl believed that scale mattered, that equipment had to match ambition, and that debt was just a tool if you knew how to use it. He thought Ray was too careful. Ray thought Carl was gambling with money he did not have. They did not argue about it often, but the distance between their approaches had been growing for years. The Massey Ferguson 1100 was the most powerful tractor either of them had ever operated. It had a 6-cylinder diesel engine, a 12-speed transmission, and enough hydraulic capacity to handle implements that would have broken smaller machines. It was built for farmers who were serious about getting bigger. It was also expensive to maintain, expensive to fuel, and expensive to insure. Ray understood what it represented. He also understood that owning a machine like that changed the way a farm had to operate. It required more acres to justify the cost. It required more risk. It required belief that the future would cooperate. Ray was not sure he had that belief. Carl did. 2 weeks after the auction, Carl brought the 1100 home and parked it in front of his machine shed. Ray drove over to see it. The tractor had been repainted, and Carl had replaced the hydraulic lines and installed new rear tires. It looked almost new. Carl was excited in a way Ray had not seen in years. He walked Ray through everything he planned to do with it, how much faster he could work his ground, how he could take on custom work for neighbors, how the extra income would more than cover the payment. Ray listened. He did not argue. When Carl asked him what he thought, Ray said it was a good-looking machine. Carl asked if Ray regretted not bidding on it. Ray said he did not. That spring, Carl worked his fields faster than Ray had ever seen anyone work. The 1100 pulled a 6-bottom plow that turned ground in half the time it took Ray with his 65. Carl planted 240 acres of wheat and milo in less than a week. He took on custom plowing for 3 neighbors and made enough to cover 2 months of payments. By June, he was talking about buying more land. Ray planted at his own pace. He used the equipment he had. He finished a week later than Carl, but he finished without borrowing anything. The summer of 1972 was dry, but not ruinously so. Wheat prices stayed strong. By August, Carl was confident he had made the right decision. He told Ray he should have bought a bigger tractor years ago. Ray said maybe so. They did not talk much after that. In the fall, both brothers harvested decent crops. Carl's yields were not as high as he had hoped, but prices were good enough to make up for it. He made his payments on time. He bought a new grain drill in October and financed it over 3 years. Ray bought nothing. He repaired his planter and kept using the equipment he had. By the end of 1972, Carl's operation looked more modern than Ray's. It also carried more debt. The winter of 1973 was quiet. Ray spent most of it maintaining his machinery and helping his wife manage the bookkeeping. Carl spent most of it planning. He talked about renting more ground. He talked about upgrading his combine. He talked about what the farm could look like in 5 years. Ray listened when they saw each other, but he did not offer opinions. He had learned that Carl did not want caution. He wanted confirmation. In March of 1973, fuel prices began to rise. It was not dramatic at first, just a few cents more each month, but by summer the cost of diesel had nearly doubled. The increase hit Carl harder than it hit Ray. The 1100 burned more fuel in a day than Ray's 65 burned in 2. Carl's custom work became less profitable because he had to raise his rates, and some of his customers started doing their own work instead. By August, Carl was behind on one payment. He caught up in September, but it took money he had planned to use for something else. That fall, grain prices dropped, not catastrophically, but enough to matter. Carl's income fell short of what he had projected. He made his payments, but he stopped talking about buying more land. Ray's income also dropped, but he had no payments to make. He put the difference in savings. He did not mention it to Carl. In 1974, the weather turned. Spring came late, and planting was delayed by 3 weeks of rain. Carl got his ground worked as soon as it dried, but the 1100 struggled in wet conditions. The front loader added weight that caused the tractor to sink in softer fields, and Carl had to wait longer than he wanted before he could finish planting. Ray planted late too, but his lighter equipment moved more easily through marginal conditions. Both brothers finished planting by mid-May. Neither expected great yields. The summer was hot and dry. By July, it was clear that 1974 was going to be a bad year. Wheat yields came in 20% below average. Milo did worse. Grain prices stayed low. Carl's custom work dried up almost completely because his neighbors were struggling as much as he was. By the end of harvest, Carl was 3 months behind on the 1100. The finance company sent him a letter in September. He caught up by selling a grain truck and borrowing money from his father-in-law. Ray did not know about the loan until later. Carl did not tell him. Ray's operation lost money in 1974, but not enough to threaten anything. He had savings. He had no debt. He tightened his budget and kept working. Carl's operation lost more, and it mattered more. He stopped talking about expansion. He stopped talking about equipment. When Ray saw him at the co-op in November, Carl looked tired in a way that went past the season. In 1975, things leveled out. Prices improved slightly. Weather was average. Both brothers made modest profits. Carl caught up on his payments and stayed current. The 1100 kept running. It was a good machine. It did not break down. It did not fail. It just cost more than Carl had planned for, and the margin he had counted on never fully appeared. Ray kept farming the way he always had. His equipment aged another year, but it still worked. He replaced a clutch in the 65 and rebuilt the carburetor in the 35. He spent $300 on parts and did the work himself. His operation remained stable. It did not grow, but it did not shrink either. Carl's operation did not grow either, but the debt kept it from feeling stable. There was always something coming due. By 1976, Carl had owned the 1100 for 4 years. He had made every payment, but it had cost him flexibility. When a neighbor offered to sell him 40 acres at a good price, Carl could not buy it because he did not have the cash and could not take on more debt. Ray could have bought it, but he did not need more ground. The 40 acres sold to someone from 2 counties over, someone who was assembling a larger operation. Carl told Ray he should have bought it just to keep it local. Ray said he did not farm out of sentiment. That comment stayed between them longer than either expected. In 1977, Carl's oldest son graduated high school. The boy was smart and uncertain about whether he wanted to farm. Carl wanted him to stay, but he did not push. Ray's son was 2 years younger and already talking about leaving. Ray did not argue with him. He had always believed that farming had to be a choice, not an obligation. Carl thought Ray was too willing to let his son go. Ray thought Carl was too willing to pressure his. The 1100 kept working. It was still a good tractor. It was still powerful. But it had also become the physical representation of a decision Carl could not undo. Every time he made a payment, he was reminded of what the machine had cost him in flexibility, in options, in the ability to respond to bad years without strain. Ray never said anything about it, but Carl knew what his brother thought. He did not need to hear it spoken. In 1978, fuel prices spiked again. Inflation was climbing. Interest rates were rising. Carl refinanced part of his debt to extend the term, which lowered his monthly payment but increased the total he would pay over time. Ray's costs went up too, but he absorbed them without restructuring anything. His operation stayed small. It stayed manageable. It stayed his. By 1980, Carl had paid off the 1100. It had taken 8 years instead of 5 because of refinancing, but the tractor was his. He felt relief, but not triumph. The machine was 12 years old by then, and it had logged thousands of hours. It still ran well, but it was no longer new, and the market for used 1100s was softer than Carl had expected. He could not sell it for half of what he had paid. He kept it. Ray's equipment kept aging. The 65 was 18 years old. The 35 was even older. Ray talked about replacing one of them, but he never did. He kept repairing what he had. Carl thought Ray was being stubborn. Ray thought Carl had learned the wrong lesson. In 1982, agriculture collapsed. Grain prices fell hard. Land values dropped. Credit tightened. Foreclosures started appearing in the weekly farm report. Carl's income fell by 40%. He had rented additional ground over the years, but now he could not afford to keep all of it. He gave up one lease and consolidated his operation back toward what it had been in the early 70s. Ray's income fell too, but he had no leases to break and no debt to service. He reduced his spending and kept farming. Carl's son, the one who had graduated in 1977, came back to the farm in 1983. He had tried college for 2 years and then worked construction for 3 more, but the economy was bad everywhere and farming felt more stable than it was. Carl was grateful to have him, but he also knew the farm was not big enough to support 2 families. He started talking about expansion again, but the talk was quieter now, less certain. Ray's son left in 1984 and did not come back. He moved to Wichita and got a job with an insurance company. Ray accepted it without bitterness. He told his wife that farming was not for everyone, and their son had made a reasonable choice. Carl thought Ray had let him go too easily. Ray thought Carl was holding on too tightly. By 1985, the 1100 was 15 years old. It still worked, but it needed more maintenance. Carl replaced the injectors, overhauled the hydraulic pump, and put new front tires on it. The repairs cost more than he wanted to spend, but he needed the tractor and could not afford to replace it. Ray's 65 needed work too, but the parts were cheaper and the repairs were simpler. Ray did most of the work himself. Carl hired a mechanic. In 1987, agriculture began to stabilize. Prices improved slightly. Land values stopped falling. Carl refinanced his remaining debt at a lower rate and started sleeping better. Ray paid cash for a used grain truck and kept his savings intact. Both brothers were still farming, but their operations looked different in ways that went beyond equipment. Carl's farm carried the marks of decisions that had seemed right at the time, but had cost more than expected. Ray's farm carried the marks of decisions that had seemed too cautious, but had survived. The 1100 kept running. Carl used it less as the years went on because newer tractors were more efficient, but he could not justify replacing it. It sat in his shed for longer stretches, coming out only for heavy work. Ray's 65 kept running too, used almost daily. It was older than the 1100, but it had never been asked to justify itself. In 1990, Carl's son got married. The young man wanted to take over more of the farm, but there was not enough income to split. Carl talked about expanding again, about renting more ground, about buying equipment that could handle more acres. His son was cautious in a way that reminded Carl of Ray. The similarity irritated Carl more than it should have. Ray turned 60 in 1991. He started thinking about retirement, though he did not talk about it much. His son in Wichita was doing well and had no interest in farming. Ray accepted that his operation would end with him. He did not see it as failure. He saw it as the natural conclusion of a farm that had served its purpose. His wife asked him once if he regretted that his son had not stayed. Ray said he regretted not having more time, but he did not regret the choices either of them had made. In 1993, Carl turned 57. He was tired in a way that felt permanent. The 1100 was 21 years old and needed another round of expensive repairs. Carl considered selling it, but the market for old high-horsepower tractors was weak. He kept it and did the minimum to keep it running. His son used it occasionally, but mostly they used newer equipment they had bought used from other farmers who were getting out. By 1995, the distance between the two brothers' farms had become obvious to anyone who paid attention. Ray's operation was smaller, older, and simpler. Carl's was larger, more complex, and more expensive to run. Neither brother was wealthy, neither was failing. But Ray had options. Carl had commitments. The difference showed up in small ways. Ray could skip a year of planting if he wanted. Carl could not. Ray could afford a bad crop without panic. Carl could not afford 2 in a row. In the spring of 1996, Carl's son brought up the idea of scaling back. He suggested they give up some rented ground, simplify the operation, reduce the overhead. Carl resisted at first. He had spent 24 years building toward something bigger, and the idea of deliberately choosing smaller felt like admitting defeat. But his son was patient. He showed Carl the numbers. He showed him what the farm could look like with less pressure, less debt, less equipment to maintain. Carl listened. He did not agree right away, but he listened. By the end of 1996, they had given up 2 leases. The farm was smaller. Carl told himself it was strategic, but it felt like retreat. Ray did not comment on it when they saw each other, but Carl knew his brother had noticed. Ray had always believed in farming only what you could manage without strain, and now Carl was moving in that direction, whether he wanted to or not. In 1998, Ray sold half his land to a neighbor and retired. He kept 80 acres and rented it out. He did not need the income, but he wanted the land to stay in production. He sold his equipment at auction and got fair prices because everything worked. The 65 sold to a young farmer who said he had learned to drive on one just like it. Ray felt good about that. The money from the sale went into savings. Ray told his wife they had enough to live on for as long as they needed. Carl kept farming. His son had taken over most of the day-to-day work, but Carl still helped during planting and harvest. The 1100 was still in the shed. It still ran. No one used it much anymore, but Carl could not bring himself to sell it. It had cost him too much to let it go for what it was worth now. His wife suggested more than once that he should just donate it or scrap it, that keeping it around was just a reminder of years he should stop thinking about. Carl said he would deal with it eventually. He never did. In 2000, the farm had its best year in a decade. Prices were good, weather cooperated. Carl's son managed everything efficiently, and they finished harvest with a profit that felt almost comfortable. Carl's son used part of it to pay off the last of the debt his father had taken on in the 80s. The farm was finally clear. Carl should have felt relief, but mostly he felt tired. He was 64 years old, and his body was reminding him of every year he had spent on a tractor seat. In 2001, Carl had a stroke. It was not severe, but it was enough to end his ability to operate machinery safely. His son took over the farm completely. Carl spent his recovery watching from the house, seeing his son make decisions that were more like Ray's than like his own. The young man paid off debt before buying equipment. He rented cautiously. He saved more than he spent. Carl did not criticize, but he noticed. He also noticed that the farm was stable in a way it had never been when he was running it. That observation did not sit easily. Ray came by to visit Carl during his recovery. They sat on the porch and did not talk much. At one point, Carl asked Ray if he ever regretted not buying the 1100 back in 1972. Ray thought about it for a long time before he answered. He said he regretted a lot of things, but that was not one of them. Carl asked what he meant. Ray said he meant that some decisions do not have right answers, just consequences you can live with or consequences you cannot. Carl asked which category the 1100 fell into. Ray said he did not know. Carl said he did not either. They sat in silence after that. The sun was going down and the fields were empty. Carl thought about the 30 years that had passed since the auction, about all the payments and repairs and seasons the 1100 had been part of. He thought about the land he had not been able to buy, the years he had spent managing debt instead of managing crops, the nights he had lain awake calculating whether he could make it through another bad year. He thought about Ray, who had never taken those risks, who had never chased the expansion Carl had believed was necessary. Ray had stayed small, Ray had stayed clear. And Ray was sitting here now, retired and comfortable, while Carl was still tied to a farm that had never quite become what he had wanted it to be. But Carl also knew that Ray's farm was ending. Ray's son was not coming back. The land Ray had kept would be sold or rented to someone else when Ray was gone, and the operation Ray had built so carefully would disappear as if it had never existed. Carl's farm would continue. His son was there. His grandchildren might farm it someday. The 1100 had been part of building that, even if it had not built it the way Carl had imagined. Ray stood up to leave. He shook Carl's hand and told him to take care of himself. Carl thanked him for coming. After Ray left, Carl sat on the porch until it was dark. He did not go inside until his wife came out and told him it was getting cold. The Massey Ferguson 1100 sat in Carl's shed for another 3 years. In 2004, Carl's son finally sold it to a salvage dealer for $800. The engine still ran, but the hydraulics were failing, and the frame had cracks that would have cost more to fix than the tractor was worth. Carl was not there when it left. He told his son he did not need to see it go. Ray heard about the sale a few weeks later. He thought about calling Carl, but he did not. There was nothing useful to say. The tractor had done what it was built to do. It had worked for 32 years. It had pulled equipment, turned ground, and helped Carl build the farm he wanted to build. It had also cost more than Carl had planned, limited his choices in bad years, and outlasted the economic conditions that had made it seem like the right decision in the first place. Ray wondered sometimes what would have happened if he had been the one to buy it. He suspected the outcome would not have been much different. The machine would have worked just as well. The debt would have constrained him just as much. The question was not whether the 1100 was a good tractor. It was. The question was whether the decision to buy it had protected what Carl was trying to build, or whether it had just postponed the inevitable narrowing of options that came with debt. Ray did not know the answer. He suspected Carl did not either. By 2005, Carl's operation had stabilized under his son's management. The farm was smaller than it had been in the late 70s, but it was profitable and debt-free. Carl's son farmed more like Ray than like his father, and the farm survived because of it. Carl accepted that without resentment, but also without celebration. He had wanted something bigger. He had believed in growth. The 1100 had been the tool he thought would make that possible. It had not made it impossible either. It had just made it harder. In 2006, Carl's health declined further. He had another stroke, smaller than the first, but it left him weaker. He spent more time in the house. He stopped going out to the fields. His son brought him reports of how things were going, and Carl listened, but he no longer offered advice. He had learned that his son did not need it. The farm was running better without his involvement than it ever had with it. Ray's health was better, but he was slowing down too. He spent his days reading, working in his garden, and visiting with his wife. They took a trip to Colorado one summer to see his son and grandchildren. Ray told his son he was proud of him, that leaving the farm had been the right choice. His son asked if Ray ever missed it. Ray said he missed the work sometimes, but not the worry. His son asked what he had worried about most. Ray said he had worried about making a mistake that could not be undone. His son asked if he ever had. Ray said he did not think so, but he had watched other people make them. In 2008, the economy collapsed again. Agriculture was affected, but not as severely as other sectors. Grain prices stayed relatively stable. Carl's son managed through it without major problems. The farm was small enough, and clear enough that it could absorb the shock. Carl watched from the house and thought about 1982, about what it had felt like to face a collapse while carrying debt. He was grateful his son did not have to experience that. Ray watched the news and thought about all the farmers he had known who had not survived the 80s. He thought about the ones who had expanded at the wrong time, who had believed too much in the future, who had borrowed against land they thought would always be worth more. He thought about Carl, who had been luckier than some and less lucky than others. He thought about the 1100, which had been sold for scrap 4 years earlier and was probably in pieces by now, melted down or repurposed into something that had nothing to do with farming. In 2010, Carl turned 74. His grandson, Carl's son's oldest boy, was 16 and talking about farming. Carl's son was not encouraging it, but he was not discouraging it either. He told his father that if the boy wanted to farm, he would let him make that choice when he was older. Carl thought that sounded like something Ray would have said. His son said maybe it was. Ray turned 79 the same year. He was in good health for his age. He still worked in his garden. He still drove into town for coffee with other retired farmers. He still talked to his son every week. His life was quiet and untroubled. He had enough money. He had no regrets that kept him awake at night. He had made it through. In 2011, Carl's son bought a used tractor at an auction. It was a newer model, more efficient, easier to maintain. Carl watched him bring it home and thought about April 14th, 1972, about the day he had bought the 1100, and Ray had walked away. He thought about everything that had come after that day, all the years of payments and work and worry, all the decisions that had followed from that one decision. He thought about whether it had been worth it. He still did not know. Ray lived another year. He died in 2012 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, most of them farmers or the children of farmers. Carl was there. He sat in the front row with his son and grandson and did not speak during the service. Afterward, people talked about Ray as a man who had farmed carefully and lived within his means. No one called him ambitious. No one called him a risk-taker. They called him steady. They called him reliable. They called him a man who had known what mattered. Carl thought about that for a long time. He thought about April 14th, 1972, when he had raised his hand and Ray had not. He thought about the 32 years the 1100 had sat on his farm, working and waiting and costing and lasting. He thought about the payments and the debt and the years when he could not expand because he was still paying for the decision to try. He thought about his son, who farmed the way Ray had farmed, and whose farm would outlast both of them because of it. He thought about his grandson, who might farm someday, who might carry the operation into a third generation. Ray's operation had ended. Carl's had not. That was the difference between them. Whether it was the right difference, Carl could not say. Carl did not regret buying the 1100. He regretted that it had not been enough. He regretted that the future had not cooperated the way he had believed it would. He regretted that his ambition had required so much justification and delivered so little margin. He regretted that Ray had been right without needing to say so. But he did not regret the decision itself. He had made it honestly. He had believed in it. And for 32 years, the Massey Ferguson 1100 had done exactly what it was built to do. It had turned ground. It had pulled equipment. It had worked. The problem was not the machine. The problem was that the machine had required a future Carl could not control, and when that future did not arrive the way he had planned, the machine became a weight instead of a tool. Ray had understood that in 1972. Carl had not learned it until much later. Carl lived another 6 years. He died in 2018 at the age of 82. His funeral was smaller than Ray's, but his son and grandson were there, and the farm was still running. The operation Carl had built, the one that had cost him so much, was still producing crops. It was still supporting his family. It had survived. Whether that survival justified the cost, Carl never decided. Ray had made different choices and received different outcomes. Both men had farmed their entire lives. Both had worked hard. Both had done what they believed was right. The Massey Ferguson 1100 had been sold for scrap 14 years before Carl died. It no longer existed in any recognizable form, but the decision to buy it and the decision not to buy it had shaped two farms and two families for more than 40 years. The machine was gone. The consequences remained. Ray had been right not to buy it. Carl had not been wrong to try. The difference between those two things was smaller than either of them had ever wanted to admit, and it was larger than either of them had lived long enough to fully understand.